Welcome back. We're picking up where we left off. As you look at the current study block, you will notice it covers 2 Kings 16 through 25 under the thematic heading, He Trusted in the Lord God of Israel. But we are actually dedicating this entire deep dive exclusively to chapter 17.
Right, which I think is a necessary sequence.
Yeah, we have a lot of ground to cover. So our progression today will move from the ground to the text and finally to the theological implications. We will begin with a narrative overview of the fall of the northern kingdom of Israel, just establishing the geopolitical reality during the Assyrian crisis. From there, we will transition into the biblical text to analyze the dual structure of the theological indictment in chapter 17. We'll examine what those redactional seams reveal about the composition of the history itself.
Right, the mechanics of how the text was built.
Exactly. And then we will look at the material record concerning early Israelite religion, specifically the archaeological evidence regarding Ashram. After that, we'll trace the physical geography of the Assyrian deportation and the subsequent textual evolution of the lost tribes' traditions.
Which is a heavily mythologized topic, so parsing the geography is crucial.
It really is. And then finally, we will step back from historical criticism to offer a concluding devotional reflection on the nature of covenant trust.
Because chapter 17 operates as the structural and theological center of gravity for the entire Deuteronomistic history.
Yes.
But before we can parse the theological arguments the author is making, we have to understand the historical material they were working with. We need to look at the state of the Northern Kingdom in the 730s BCE, and, well, that requires a brief retrospective on the reign of Jeroboam II.
So let us establish that both line. The era of Jeroboam II, which concluded around 747 BCE, it was not a period of decline at all.
No, quite the opposite.
Right. It was an era of sprawling territorial expansion and highly concentrated wealth. When you read the prophets Amos and Hosea, they are documenting this specific society.
Yeah, a society that was deeply stratified.
Exactly. They describe a nation characterized by severe economic disparity, the construction of winter houses and summer houses, and a pervasive sense of military and political complacency.
Right.
The Northern Kingdom felt completely secure.
And they felt secure because the major regional powers were temporarily dormant. But that stability shatters abruptly upon Jeroboam II's death.
It falls apart very quickly.
It does. The sequence of events following 747 BCE is defined by severe internal chaos and a rapid succession of political assassinations.
Yeah.
I mean, Jeroboam's son, Zechariah, he manages to hold the throne for a mere 6 months before he's murdered by Shallum.
6 months.
Right, and then Shallum, in turn, lasts only 1 month before he's assassinated by Menahem. The monarchy is just consuming itself from within.
And this internal collapse aligns precisely with a profound external shift, which is the resurgence of Assyria under Tiglath-Pileser III.
Yes. And Tiglath-Pileser III alters the geopolitical reality of the ancient Near East entirely. Prior Assyrian kings generally functioned by conducting punitive raids.
Just going in and extracting wealth.
Right. They would march a military force into the Levant, extract heavy tribute from local rulers, and then simply return to Mesopotamia. But Tiglath-Pileser III systematizes a different imperial model.
A model of permanent occupation, essentially.
Exactly. He perfects the strategy of converting vassal states into directly administered Assyrian provinces, and he does this to the northern kingdom of Israel incrementally.
Which we see recorded earlier in Ticking 15. Tiglath-Pileser had already stripped away the northern and eastern territories, Galilee and the Transjordan region of Gilead. He deported those regional populations and reorganized the land under Assyrian governors.
So by the time we arrive at the reign of Hoshea, who is the final king of Israel, the entity we refer to as the Northern Kingdom is no longer the expansive 12-tribe region of earlier centuries. It has been reduced to a rump state. It is essentially just the capital city of Samaria and its immediate agricultural hinterland in the central hill country.
And Hoshea himself comes to power through that established pattern of violence we mentioned, assassinating his predecessor, Pekah. Now, initially, Hoshea recognizes the reality of his situation. He acts as a compliant vassal and pays the heavy tribute demanded by Assyria.
He plays the game.
He does. But the fatal turning point occurs when there is a transition of power in Nineveh. Tiglath-Pileser dies, and Shalmaneser V assumes the Assyrian throne.
And Hoshea observes this transition and makes a calculated geopolitical gamble. He ceases his tribute payments to Shalmaneser and sends envoys to establish a defensive alliance with a figure the text calls, so, king of Egypt.
Yeah, and the specific identity of this Egyptian ruler remains a matter of historical debate, right?
Yes, very much so. He is frequently identified with Sargon IV, or perhaps a regional delta ruler whose name has been preserved in a garbled form in the Hebrew text.
But the identity of the monarch is secondary to the pattern of the decision. Hosea is making the familiar, doomed gamble of a minor state caught between empires.
Yeah, we see this pattern constantly.
He places his trust in a distant, fragmented power, which is Egypt, over the immediate and existential threat of the Assyrian military machine.
Right. And Shalmaneser V responds with the standard Assyrian protocol for a rebellious vassal. He marches on the Levant and lays siege to Samaria. And the text notes, this siege lasts for 3 years.
3 years.
Yes, and we need to be clear about what that entails. In ancient Near Eastern warfare, a 3-year siege against a walled hill city is a process of slow, methodical starvation.
It's brutal.
It is. The Assyrian army would have established a circumvallation wall around Samaria, cutting off all agricultural supply lines and water access, just waiting for the internal population to succumb to famine and disease before even attempting to breach the walls.
And there is a historical complication that occurs near the conclusion of this 3-year period. Shalmaneser V dies, or is deposed, right as the siege is ending.
Right, yes.
So it is his successor, Sargon II, who claims the actual victory in his own royal annals.
And Assyriologists continue to debate whether Sargon II genuinely commanded the final breach of the city, or if he merely appropriated the credit for a campaign his predecessor had already effectively won.
That transition of Assyrian kings matters for establishing our modern chronologies, dating the fall of Samaria to 722 or 721 BCE. However, for the inhabitants of Samaria, the distinction between Shalmaneser and Sargon was entirely irrelevant.
Absolutely irrelevant.
The outcome was the systematic unmaking of their kingdom. The Assyrians employed their administrative machinery to deport the surviving elite, the military class, and the specialized artisans, fundamentally erasing the northern kingdom as a political entity.
They completely dismantled the state structure.
Which requires a pivot in our analysis here. We have established the geopolitical history, but we need to recognize how the biblical text handles these events. A modern historian examining the fall of Samaria would focus extensively on Hosea's strategic miscalculations, or the shifts in Assyrian administrative policy, or even the logistics of Iron Age siege warfare.
Right, the mechanics of it all.
Exactly. Yet the writer of 2 Kings allocates only a verse and a half to these political mechanics. Verse 4 details Hosea's withholding of tribute and his outreach to Egypt. Immediately following that, the text launches into a dense, sustained theological argument.
It's a striking shift in focus.
It is. Our objective is to examine how the biblical author utilizes this political history merely as the raw material to construct a complex theological indictment regarding covenant failure.
Well, to parse that theological argument, we need to look closely at the structure of the indictment in 2 Kings 17. Because when we read verses 7 through 18, we observe a very specific, closed logical loop built on a because-therefore framework.
The text is very meticulous here.
Highly meticulous. It lists the offenses. Because the children of Israel sinned against the Lord, because they feared other gods, because they built high places and set up sacred pillars. And then the conclusion arrives in verse 18. Therefore, the Lord was very angry and removed them from his sight.
And this litany of offenses serves as the culmination of the overarching thesis of the Deuteronomistic history. Throughout the books of Kings, the author has systematically evaluated every northern monarch against a single metric.
The sin of Jeroboam.
Yes, the sin of Jeroboam. We see the repeated formula that a king did evil in the sight of the Lord and departed not from the sins of Jeroboam. So here in chapter 17, the historian brings that accumulated multi-generational judgment to its final conclusion.
Therefore, verse 18 is the logical terminus of 2 centuries of recorded covenant violation.
Right.
But the argument is coherent and self-contained only up to verse 18. A critical structural seam appears at verse 19.
It's quite jarring when you read it.
Very jarring. The text abruptly states, Judah also did not keep the commandments of the Lord their God, but walked in the customs which Israel had introduced.
Which introduces a glaring temporal dissonance. I mean, within the internal timeline of the narrative at this exact moment in chapter 17, the southern kingdom of Judah has not yet fallen.
No, it will persist for another century and a half.
Right. Yet at verse 19, Judah is suddenly implicated in the very same completed judgment that has just been pronounced upon Israel.
And this specific verse is one of the primary pieces of evidence supporting theories regarding the compositional history of the text. The narrative frame shatters, revealing the hand of a later editor who is looking back at events that have already concluded for both the northern and southern nations.
So let's examine the scholarly models for how this text was constructed. Frank Moore Cross advanced a highly influential two-edition theory for the Deuteronomistic history.
Right, the DTR1 and DTR2 model.
Yes. He proposed an initial edition, which scholars term DTR1, compiled during the reign of King Josiah in the late 7th century BCE.
And the DTR1 edition was fundamentally optimistic. It structured the historical narrative to point toward Josiah's religion reforms as the grand, successful resolution to Israel's historical failures.
He was the culmination of the story.
Josiah was presented as the ideal Davidic king who would restore the covenant.
However, because Josiah was unexpectedly killed by the Egyptians at Megiddo, and Judah subsequently fell to the Babylonians a few decades later, the optimistic narrative of DTR1 failed to align with historical reality.
The ending didn't work anymore.
Right. So Cross argued that a second exilic editor, DTR2, had to revise the text. This later editor grafted in explanations for Judah's judgment, ensuring the theological framework accounted for the reality of the Babylonian exile.
And under Cross's model, verses 7 through 18 of 2 Kings 17 belong to the primary narrative explaining the fall of the north, while verse 19 represents the precise point where the exilic editor inserted an update, binding Judah to the same unavoidable fate.
I understand the elegance of the two-edition theory. It makes a lot of sense. But the field has not remained entirely unified behind Cross's model.
No, it hasn't.
The Göttingen school, represented by scholars such as Rudolf Smend, Walter Dietrich, and Timo Viola, they push back against the idea of a single Josianic edition, followed by one neat exilic update.
Yeah, the Göttingen scholars propose a much more complex redactional history. They argue for a series of multiple redactional layers, all occurring during the exilic period.
Not just one or two hands, but a whole school of editors.
Exactly. They identified different editors working with different theological priorities. So, for example, a prophetic redactor who inserted the narratives about Elijah and Elisha, a nomistic redactor focused heavily on obedience to the law, and so on.
Do you feel that the proposition of multiple exilic redactors overcomplicates the text unnecessarily? Or does it better account for the varying theological voices we find in Kings?
Well, I think it accounts for the friction within the text. Even if one finds the specific subdivisions of the Göttingen school overly granular, their broader point holds. The text of Kings was not written in a single sitting by a single historian.
It is a composite document.
It is. Despite the debate over the exact number of editorial hands, whether it was DTR1 and DTR2, or a series of exilic schools, there is broad consensus that the disjunction at verse 19 exposes the composite, layered nature of the text.
Moving from the mechanics of composition to an interpretive synthesis, we must consider the rhetorical weight of this theological architecture. The text dedicates one verse to the political explanation of Samaria's fall and 16 verses to covenant theology.
A massive imbalance.
Yes, the author is establishing that historical events are subordinated to the requirements of the covenantal logic. That logic dictates a simple conditional premise. Obedience yields presence in the land, and rebellion yields expulsion.
And that conditional premise is the theological engine of the entire history.
This specific theological architecture provides a crucial point of connection for readers of the Book of Mormon, particularly for an audience familiar with the theological debates surrounding the late First Temple period.
Yeah.
When we examine the language used by Nephi early in his records, specifically in 1 Nephi chapter 2, we encounter a direct articulation of this principle. The Lord tells Nephi, "Inasmuch as ye shall keep my commandments, ye shall prosper, and shall be led to a land of promise. But inasmuch as thy brethren shall rebel against thee, they should be cut off from the presence of the Lord."
And that phrasing is not a generic religious sentiment. It utilizes the precise conditional grammar of the Deuteronomistic history.
It is the exact inasmuch as conditional structure, the paired blessing and curse, and the specific terminology of being cut off from the presence of God.
Right, it's very specific terminology.
It mirrors the language of expulsion and exile we are reading in 2 Kings 17. It demonstrates that Lehi and Nephi were deeply formed by this specific textual and theological milieu prior to their departure from Jerusalem in the late 7th century BCE.
They belong to that intellectual world.
They did. The Book of Mormon utilizes the exact rhetorical and theological framework of the Deuteronomistic writers to structure its own narrative regarding the Nephites and Lamanites.
The continuity of that framework is evident. But, returning to the specific indictments leveled by the Deuteronomistic historian in 2 Kings 17, we need to examine the actual religious practices the text condemns.
Right.
Because verse 10 states that the Israelites set up for themselves sacred pillars and asherim on every high hill and under every green tree.
Now, the term asherim, which is the plural of Asherah, presents a fundamental ambiguity in biblical scholarship.
It really does.
The debate centers on whether the text is referring to a wooden cultic object, a stylized tree or pole that stood beside an altar, or if it is referring to the distinct Canaanite goddess Asherah, known from earlier Ugaritic texts as Atharat, the consort of the high deity El.
And the material evidence discovered in the past half-century has complicated this question immensely, just forcing historians to reevaluate the biblical text entirely. The most critical archaeological site in this regard is Kuntalet Ajrud.
Let us detail the findings at Kuntalet Ajrud. This is a remote 8th century BCE way station in the eastern Sinai Desert, excavated in the 1970s by Zaev Meshel.
Right, and Meshel's team unearthed several large storage jars known as pithoi. These jars were covered in inscriptions and drawings.
Which is an incredible find in that region.
It is, and the most significant of these inscriptions utilize blessing formulas. We find texts reading, "I bless you by Yahweh of Samaria and his Asherah, and I bless you by Yahweh of Teman and his Asherah."
And a similar inscription, though slightly later in date, was also found carved into the wall of a tomb at Khirbet el-Qom in the Judean hills.
Yes.
These inscriptions provide contemporary epigraphic evidence directly associating Yahweh with an Asherah. But this introduces a complex grammatical debate regarding the Hebrew text on those storage jars.
The grammar is the sticking point.
Right, because in standard biblical Hebrew, a proper noun, such as the specific name of a deity, cannot make a possessive pronominal suffix. You cannot grammatically say his Yahweh or his Asherah if Asherah is functioning as a proper name.
And that grammatical rule, well, that is essentially the crux of the debate among epigraphers and historians. Scholars such as William Dever, Saul Olien, and Judith Hadley have analyzed this extensively.
It's been debated for decades now.
Exactly. Because a proper noun representing a specific goddess should not logically take his suffix in Hebrew grammar, many argue that his Asherah must refer to a cultic object. It would refer to the wooden pole or stylized tree that symbolized the divine feminine, rather than the proper name of the goddess herself.
Which would mean the inscription is blessing the reader by Yahweh and by his sacred cultic object.
Exactly. However, others argue that the grammar of colloquial or regional Hebrew dialects might have allowed for a proper noun to take a suffix. Or perhaps that the cultic object and the goddess were functionally inseparable in the minds of the worshippers.
So they wouldn't distinguish between the two.
Right. If the object represented the goddess, blessing someone by his Asherah was functionally invoking the divine pair.
The visual iconography accompanying the inscriptions at Kuntalet Ajrud does not provide a definitive resolution either. There are drawings beneath the inscriptions depicting figures.
Very ambiguous figures.
Right. Some scholars, like William Dever, have interpreted these figures as representations of Yahweh and Asherah, identifying a seated lyre player in the drawing as the goddess.
Conversely, scholars like Judith Hadley have argued that the figures represent the Egyptian deity Bes, whose iconography was common in the region, or perhaps just ritual dancers.
Hadley points out that the lyre player exhibits male characteristics.
Yes, which significantly complicates Dever's identification of the figure as Asherah. So the visual evidence remains deeply contested and does not cleanly resolve the grammatical ambiguity.
While Kuntalet Ajrud provides the most explicit textual pairing of Yahweh and an Asherah, we must also consider the broader material culture of the period. We see this specifically in the Judean pillar figurines.
Right. The pillar figurines are ubiquitous. These are small, standardized terracotta figures, typically depicting a female with exaggerated physical features holding her breasts. The base of the figurine is a solid pillar resembling a tree trunk.
And they date primarily to the 8th and 7th centuries BCE.
Yes, and they have been excavated by the hundreds across the territory of Judah, including within Jerusalem itself.
The critical detail regarding these figurines is their archaeological context. They are predominantly found in domestic contexts, ordinary private households rather than in specialized temple precincts or royal sanctuaries.
Which tells us a lot about how they were used.
It does. The sheer volume and location of these findings indicate that the veneration associated with these objects was not a fringe esoteric practice restricted to royal sanctuaries on high places. It was a pervasive element of daily domestic religious life for the average Israelite and Judean family.
And when we place this material reality alongside the biblical text, we find the text occasionally undermining its own retroactive polemic.
How so?
Well, the Deuteronomistic historian frames the Asherim as a foreign, apostate contamination. Yet Deuteronomy 16.21 issues a specific legal prohibition. You shall not plant for yourself an Asherah of any kind of wood beside the altar of the Lord your God.
A law is only necessary if the practice is actively and regularly occurring.
Exactly. Furthermore, in 2 Kings 23, during the account of Josiah's religious reforms in the late 7th century, the text records that Josiah removed the Asherah from the temple of the Lord in Jerusalem.
We must pause on that detail. The Asherah was not merely an element of rural apostasy in the northern kingdom, as chapter 17 might imply.
No, it wasn't.
It was housed within the primary Jerusalem temple itself, and presumably it had been there for an extended period, operating as an accepted part of the temple apparatus until Josiah ordered its removal and destruction.
And this evidence forms the basis of Saul Olion's influential argument regarding the cult of Yahweh. Olion asserts that the veneration of the Asherah was not an external foreign contamination of an originally pristine Yahwism,
But rather an internal element.
Right. For centuries, the inclusion of the Asherah, whether understood as a consort or a sacred symbol of the divine feminine, was a normative component of Yahweh worship for many Israelites and Judeans.
So the biblical text is offering a specific perspective on that history.
Exactly. The sweeping condemnation we read in the Deuteronomistic history reflects the perspective of a later reforming minority faction. This faction successfully retrojected its own strict, monolatrous theology onto the past, framing what had been the historical norm as a severe apostasy that justified national destruction.
For a Latter-day Saint audience, this scholarly reconstruction regarding Josiah's reforms, suppressing earlier elements of Israelite religion, intersects directly with the work of Margaret Barker.
Yes, Barker's work is very relevant here.
Barker's broader thesis argues that Josiah's purges were not merely removing foreign idols, but deliberately eradicating an older, legitimate layer of First Temple theology.
A theology that included complex divine counsel imagery, concepts of divine mediation, and a heavenly feminine presence associated with wisdom and the tree of life.
While Barker's extensive reconstructions remain debated within the broader academy, it is vital to recognize that her premises are built directly upon the foundation of this specific, contested archaeological and textual evidence regarding the Asherim.
The material record is what makes her arguments possible.
Right. When the writer of 2 Kings 17 condemns the northern kingdom for setting up Asherim, they are engaging in a theological argument about what constitutes legitimate Yahwism, a definition that was actively being contested and rewritten during this period.
Returning to the narrative arc of chapter 17, once the theological indictment is fully established, the text resumes the historical account of the Assyrian deportation itself.
The physical reality of the exile.
Yes. Verse 6 states, "In the 9th year of Hoshea, the king of Assyria captured Samaria, and he carried the Israelites away to Assyria and placed them in Hala and on the Habor, the river of Gozan, and in the cities of the Medes."
We need to examine these specific geographical coordinates. They are not mythological realms, they are concrete historical locations.
Very concrete.
Gozan is securely identified by archaeologists as Tel Holof, situated on the Khabur River in modern northeastern Syria. It is well documented in Assyrian administrative records as the provincial center Guzana.
And the Habor is the Khabur River itself, which is a major tributary of the Euphrates. Therefore, the phrase, the Habor, the river of Gozan, delineates a specific geographical zone, the Khabur Triangle.
And we know this region was used for resettlements.
We do. External Assyrian records confirm that this agricultural region was a primary destination for populations deported from the western Levant.
The reference to the cities of the Medes is equally grounded in the historical record, and it offers a rare instance of precise external corroboration of the biblical text.
It's a fascinating alignment of sources.
It is. Media was located in the Zagros Mountains of western Iran, forming the eastern frontier of the Assyrian Empire.
And at the Assyrian capital of Dur-Sharrukin, archaeologists excavated the annals of Sargon II. In these monumental inscriptions, Sargon explicitly boasts of settling deportees from Samaria into the territory of the Medes.
The biblical text and the Assyrian royal monuments align perfectly on this detail of imperial policy.
They do. The Assyrians placed the Israelites on their eastern border, likely to serve as a buffer population against external threats.
The only location in verse 6 that resists clear identification is Hala. Scholars have proposed connections to an Assyrian administrative district near Nineveh, but the evidence is not definitive. We must also be careful to distinguish it from the major Assyrian city of Kala, despite the phonetic similarity in English.
Right, those are distinct places. But the critical point to draw from this geography is that the Assyrian deportation was a calculated exercise in population engineering.
It was highly systematic.
Extremely. The objective was to dismantle political and ethnic cohesion by uprooting conquered peoples and distributing them across various imperial provinces, while simultaneously importing different populations into the vacated territories.
It was a brutal administrative procedure designed to integrate conquered peoples into the Assyrian economy and military. It was not a banishment into a mystical void.
No, not at all.
And this historical reality stands in stark contrast to the subsequent evolution of the Lost Tribes myth. We need to be precise about how this mythology developed, tracing the text that generated it.
It's important to separate the history from the later theology.
If we look at the earliest prophetic texts dealing with a return from exile, such as Jeremiah chapters 3, 16, 23, and 31, we frequently encounter the phrase, "from the land of the north."
And it is essential to read Jeremiah within his historical context. The land of the north does not indicate a hidden, uncharted geographical location where the 10 tribes are sequestered.
What does it indicate?
It refers to the strategic direction of Mesopotamian invasions. Both the Assyrian and Babylonian empires, while located to the east of Israel and Mesopotamia, followed the arc of the Fertile Crescent. They traveled north along the Euphrates and then descended upon the Levant from the north.
Thus, Jeremiah's language primarily addresses the later Babylonian exile of Judah, anticipating their return from that specific northern trajectory.
Right, he's talking about a known route.
While later interpreters expanded this language to include the northern kingdom as well, Jeremiah is operating within the known geography of the ancient Near East.
The tradition that explicitly constructs the narrative of the 10 tribes hiding in a distant, unknown land originates much later. It is found in the pseudepigraphal text of 2 Esdras, specifically chapter 13.
This requires some background. 2 Esdras is a Jewish apocalyptic text composed roughly in the late 1st century CE, hundreds of years after the actual deportation of Samaria.
Yes, very late text. In the vision recorded in chapter 13, the 10 tribes resolve to leave the multitude of the nations. They cross the Euphrates River and journey for a year and a half to a further country where no human has ever dwelt.
And the text identifies this hidden land as Arzareth.
Right. And the scholarship regarding the name Arzareth is particularly revealing. Zvi Ben-Dor Benite, in his extensive study of the Lost Tribes traditions, details how this name came into existence.
It's not a real place, is it?
No, Arzareth is not a historical toponym. It is almost certainly a scribal artifact. In Hebrew, the phrase for another land is simply Eretz Heret. We see this phrase used in Deuteronomy 29 to describe the land of exile.
So over centuries of textual transmission, as these traditions were translated from Hebrew or Aramaic into Greek and eventually into Latin, this descriptive phrase, Eretz Heret, was contracted and misunderstood by scribes.
Exactly. They treated it as a proper geographical name, Arzareth.
The mystical hidden homeland of the 10 tribes, a concept that has driven centuries of exploration and theological speculation, is in reality a philological error that calcified into a geographical myth.
It is a translation error that became a map. And this textual history demands intellectual honesty, particularly within a Latter-day Saint context where the gathering of Israel is a central theological tenet.
Yes, the Arzareth tradition from 2 Esdras was adopted uncritically by several early figures in our tradition. James E. Talmage, in his highly influential work, Articles of Faith, explicitly cited the 2 Esdras account of the journey to Arzareth.
He presented it as history.
He presented it as though it provided a settled historical record of the tribe's migration, rather than recognizing it as a late first-century apocalyptic invention based on a translation error.
Right, and it is crucial to differentiate between the adoption of that pseudepigraphal geography and the distinct scriptural language found in the Doctrine and Covenants. Sections 110 and 133 utilize the phrase North countries.
This should be understood as a 19th century Restoration theological development operating within a symbolic and eschatological register. It functions independently of the historical claims of 2 Esdras.
Conflating the symbolic gathering language of the Doctrine and Covenants with the flawed historical geography of 2 Esdras obscures the nature of both texts.
When we set aside the later mythology and rely on the historical and archaeological record, the fate of the northern deportees is clear. They assimilated.
Completely assimilated.
Like dozens of other populations subjected to Assyrian deportation policies, they were absorbed into the cultural, religious, and demographic fabric of the Near East over successive generations.
They were not lost in the sense of being hidden as an intact, discrete community awaiting discovery. They were lost to assimilation. This was the intended outcome of the Assyrian policy.
The biblical text acknowledges this process of assimilation and demographic replacement in the latter half of chapter 17. Beginning in verse 24, the Deuteronomistic historian details how the king of Assyria brought people from Babylon, Cutha, Ava, Hamath, and Sepharvaim and settled them in the cities of Samaria in place of the Israelites.
And the text describes these imported populations as highly syncretic. Verse 33 states, "They feared the Lord, but they also served their own gods, after the manner of the nations from among whom they had been carried away."
We must read this segment of the text critically.
Sure.
Modern demographic studies and archaeological surveys of the region suggest that the Assyrians did not entirely depopulate the rural hinterlands of Israel.
No, the agriculture still needed to function.
Exactly. A significant lower-class Israelite population remained on the land, working the agriculture.
Therefore, the text's narrative of wholesale foreign replacement serves a distinct theological and political agenda. The Deuteronomistic writer is systematically constructing a case against the legitimacy of the remaining inhabitants of the North.
By framing them as entirely foreign.
By framing them as thoroughly foreign, imported, and religiously compromised, the text establishes the polemical foundation for the intense Judean-Samaritan hostility that we see fully developed centuries later in the New Testament period.
The narrative of 2 Kings 17 creates the category of the Samaritan as the illegitimate other.
It builds the theological wall between them.
We have spent this hour engaged in rigorous critical inquiry. We have analyzed redactional seams, evaluated contested epigraphy regarding the Ashram, and separated the historical events of the Assyrian deportation from later theological myth-making.
All of which is vital work.
This analytical work is vital for understanding the text in its ancient context. However, as we approach the conclusion of this deep dive, we must acknowledge a shift in our approach. We move now from the realm of historical scholarship to faithful reflection, considering how this text functions as scripture for a modern audience.
Because the overarching theme for this section of the study block is "He trusted in the Lord God of Israel."
Right.
While that phrase anticipates King Hezekiah's eventual reliance on the covenant during the crisis of Judah, chapter 17 serves as the dark mirror to that theme. This chapter provides a detailed autopsy of a kingdom that definitively failed to trust.
What merits careful attention when reading the narrative as a spiritual record rather than mere history is the nature of the apostasy it describes. The fall of Israel was not triggered by a sudden cataclysmic rejection of the divine.
No, it was one single moment.
It was a slow, generational erosion.
The collapse of Israel was not the result of one wholly culpable decision made in a vacuum by a single monarch. It was the culmination of decades of subtle recalibrations.
Trust shifting.
Trust did not vanish instantly. It shifted incrementally. Over successive reigns, the monarchy and the people gradually transferred their reliance from the covenantal promises of Yahweh to more immediate, pragmatic mechanisms of security.
Like military alliances.
Exactly. Hosea's desperate, fatal attempt to forge an alliance with Egypt was merely the final, logical manifestation of a people who had long since decided that geopolitical maneuvering offered more tangible safety than the demands of their covenant.
This ancient pattern mirrors the modern anatomy of apostasy. The departure from faith is rarely a single dramatic rupture. It occurs through a series of quiet accommodations.
Small compromises.
We find ourselves trusting the immediate, our own modern Egypt, because relying on the covenant requires a patience and a vulnerability that feel dangerous in moments of crisis.
We want a solution we can see.
Right, we gravitate towards solutions that appear closer, more visible, and more subject to our own control, slowly displacing our reliance on the Lord.
Yet, despite the severity of the Deuteronomistic historian's judgment in chapter 17, the preservation of the text itself preserves a profound theological hope.
The text itself is a sign of hope.
The covenant, even when violated, remains an offer. It is not a mechanism designed to trap the people in inevitable failure. The fact that this history of failure was meticulously preserved, copied, and studied by the communities in exile demonstrates their underlying belief that the relationship was not permanently severed.
The door remained open.
Yes.
This connects directly to the nature of the Savior's invitation. When Jesus Christ says, "Come follow me," the invitation is fundamentally structured as a return.
It is not a demand for unblemished perfection on the first attempt. I mean, the entire history of ancient Israel is a testament that such perfection is impossible.
True repentance is the willingness to recognize the drift, to identify the ways we have substituted pragmatic alliances for covenant trust, and to turn back. We must resist the conclusion that the distance we have traveled makes the journey of return futile.
We might view the historical tragedy of the Northern Kingdom as a physical manifestation of a spiritual risk. The Assyrian strategy of deportation was devastating precisely because it was designed to sever a people's identity by removing them physically from their sacred geography.
Displacing them.
Displacing them from the center of their religious and cultural world, leading to their eventual assimilation and loss of covenant identity.
As you consider this chapter in the days ahead, reflect on the ways in which modern life functions as a quiet, steady process of Assyrian resettlement.
That's a profound way to look at it.
The fragmentation of our attention, the relentless demands of our time, and the subtle cultural pressures all serve to displace us from our spiritual center. Resisting this displacement requires intentional, daily effort to remember our true citizenship within the covenant.
It requires daily trust.
It requires choosing repeatedly to trust the Lord, rather than the myriad Egypts that offer the illusion of safety. We thank you for joining us for this extensive examination of the text. When we return, we will shift our focus southward to King Hezekiah, the siege of Jerusalem, and the crisis that nearly brought Judah to the same end.